G'day everyone, my name's Tricia Stewart and I'm the Natural Areas Team Leader at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Victoria at the Cranbourne Gardens. Where we are here is the conservation zone. So essentially we've got a 20 hectare botanic display which encompasses all the Australian native plants, and then that's surrounded by 340 hectares of natural bushland. It's all remnant bushland around here, and it's made up of a number of different ecological vegetation classes, from grasslands, which is what we see out behind me to the left, through to grassy woodlands and heathlands, things that all naturally occurred throughout the landscape here in Cranbourne. This is a really great question, and it's one that's very close to my heart. I'm an avid wildlife gardener in my own home garden. The first thing you need to know is exactly what birds and insects you're trying to attract to your garden, and in order to know that, you need to know which ones are locally indigenous to your area and which ones are likely to still be occurring in the area. So with that in mind, there are three basic principles that anyone needs to look at, and that is food, shelter and water. So if you were trying to attract local honeyeater species and spinebills, you would need to look at a nectar source for those birds. So what is the nectar food that you're providing in your garden? If you're trying to attract blue wrens and thornbills, so really small birds, you would need to look at a shelter source for them. So something like a dense and prickly shrub, which is where they can go to escape predators who, will often try and prey on small birds. So things like cats and dogs and things like that in the urban landscape. If you have butcherbirds or larger birds like black cockatoos in your area, then you would need to look at what's a food source for them. So whether that's attracting more insects for them to feed on, or larger trees like allocasuarinas that provide a seed and a nut source for birds like cockatoos. And then obviously water. Everyone needs water. So having bird baths and ponds in your garden, not just great for birds, but also great for frogs, lizards throughout the year, particularly in our hot summers. If you want to look at insects specifically, the same three principles apply. We provide them with food, shelter and water. With insects, the food's a little bit more complex in that you have to provide the food source not only for the adult insect, but you also need to provide a food source for the larval stages of insects. So things like native grasses are a brilliant source of larval food. Things like a poa species actually hosts 26 species of butterfly larvae on it. Kangaroo grass, so Themata, is the host plant for another 13 species of butterflies in Australia. The shelter sources for insects is also a slightly different group. So rather than providing them necessarily with types of plants, you want to provide them with things like fallen logs, mulch, anything where they can bore in or underneath. Resist the urge to clean up leaf litter around your garden, as that's a really great area for insects in larval form and in adult form to live. Also, the more insects you have, often the more birds that you will have as well. So it's all part of one big, beautiful sphere of ecology in your own garden. So transitioning gardens is a really relevant question for a lot of people. So I guess my first key point is slow and steady. There's no point going in and just ripping out everything and trying to start with a blank slate, as tempting as that is, because when you've got a blank slate, it provides nothing to our local wildlife at all. So the second point is that not all European plants are necessarily bad ones. So a lot of European species, or just exotic species, provide a lot of supplementary resources to our native species as well. So Osteospermum daisies, cottage plants, herbs and things like that. You find that native bees and things still love those species. So when you want to start transitioning plants in and out, aim for the weediest, most invasive species, and they're your first ones to go. So you might look at switching out your agapanthus for a Dianella species instead. You might look at taking out a blackberry and replacing it with a native raspberry. So there are a lot of alternatives that are quite similar to the exotic species, but are an indigenous and less invasive version of it. my favourite flowers in my home garden, the native pea species. So something like an Indigo australis. It's a beautiful one, you can't go past it. Beautiful pink sprays of pea flowers, which is great for any of our local wildlife as well. They love the pea flowers. In the Cranbourne Gardens is probably different. It's very complex and it changes seasonally as to what my favourite plants are. So in springtime, my favourites would be the acacias, beautiful scent on the wind, the promise of warmer, longer days coming into summer. In summer, my favourite wildflower is Hyacinth orchid, which is a big, showy, native terrestrial orchid. In autumn and winter, it's probably not even a plant as such. It's all the native fungus that appear, so every shape, colour, size that you can think of, some of which glow in the dark. So depending on the season, my favourite plant changes. So we do have a range of challenges that we need to try and face each day, and they include both plants and animals. It's probably surprising for a lot of people to realise that a lot of the weedy plant species that we have to manage here are actually Australian native species, but they're not locally Indigenous to the area, and that means they can actually outcompete a lot of our local Indigenous species. So one of the things that makes, things like Sallow Wattle and sweet Pittosporum really challenging for us, even though they are a native species, is once they start occurring outside the natural range, usually their natural range has a number of elements that control how many of those species are going to grow in an area. They have other natural species that kind of compete with them. Once they start to appear in areas that aren't evolved with them, they don't have the natural competition to keep their numbers in check. And essentially what can happen is if they're a really strong species, so something like sweet Pittosporum, it has a heavy fruit burden on it, so birds can spread it far and wide. It actually manages to outcompete any of the plants that grow underneath it, and it can become a monoculture. Luckily for me, we have a really strong, mighty team of volunteers that come and work with my very small team on a weekly basis. And one of the ways that we manage those, so things like Sallow Wattle, sweet Pittosporum, Kunzia, we have to go through and we sweep through the bushland and we tackle all of those. And it's a long-term project as well, so it's not a one-off go through and treat these weeds. We need to keep revisiting those areas and make sure that we're pulling out any new ones that come in. The reason for that is a lot of those species are what we call garden escapes. So they are ones that people have actually purchased from their native section in the nursery. One of the ways people can really assist us to keep our bushland areas free of those weeds is rather than go to the big chain garden centres that are across all of Australia, hit up your local community-run Indigenous nursery and they'll be able to give you species that are local to the area and they won't escape out of your garden and then infest local bushland reserves. As far as pest animals, we do get a few pest animals in here. We have a predator-proof fence up around our site which does help keep those animals out. One of the other really key pest species that we get, particularly in urban areas, are people's household moggies, the faithful cat that everyone loves. They can be quite destructive out in the bushland. So when you have species like bandicoots, small native rodents, small lizards, small birds, cats and foxes are hugely destructive to those populations. And so we do have to have ongoing programs to control both pest, flora and fauna species in our site. There are so many great places to walk around the Cranbourne Gardens here, and I'm probably really lucky as I know all the nooks and crannies. And often, I guess as staff, I have the benefit that I go off the tracks quite a lot, which is very naughty, don't do it. But you might be walking through the gardens and you'll hear something move in the bushes. There's a 50% chance it's going to be a wallaby and there's a 50% chance that it's going to be me out there looking for fungi or looking for birds or cool insects. But if I have to choose an actual walking track and not just off in the bush, in the vegetation somewhere, I'd probably say one of the wetland walks tracks. It takes me nice and close to all the different waterways, the dams like this one, I get to hear frogs, see the water birds out there, and that takes me out around the grasslands as well, where there's plenty of wallabies and kangaroos to be spotted. So wetlands walk, I highly encourage it.